I'm Teresa Schober. I'm an archaeologist in Southwest Florida. There's an interesting history to shellfish. Down here in Southwest Florida, people love to come down and wander the beaches, pick up shells, go shelling. But they also have an interesting history that's a complex mix of ecology and geology, biology, and human history, or archaeology. A long time ago, before humans were in Florida, before the human history here, Florida was completely covered by the ocean. And so it was a mix of ocean sediments and shallow seas, and animals were living and dying in that environment, and they were falling down to the bottom of the ocean and being compressed into layers that today are the limestone and dolomite and shelly sediments that underlie the Florida we know today. When we look at a seashell or pick one up on the beach, those seashells are the inorganic remnants of an animal that used to be alive. So when you just look at the shell itself, it's really like an exoskeleton to a marine mollusk that once was moving all around the ocean floor. The study of those shells is called conchology. When people first moved to Florida, the coast was about 100 miles west of where it is today. So Bonita Springs, which we enjoy being right on the water, you would have had to get in your car and drive another hour at highway speed to get to the coast of Florida. So the people coming into Florida at that time had a very different environment than the one we enjoy today. Through time, as the ice sheets that covered Canada and the northern United States melted, sea level began to rise, and it rose until around 5,000 years ago. So between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, we have these archaeological sites that are on our present-day coast, including some here in Bonita Springs. The American Indians, the indigenous peoples of Florida that were using those sites, were harvesting resources from the estuaries. These shallow water bodies that today are between the barrier islands and our mainland coast, that are a mix of fresh and salt water that support a whole host of unique habitats for each of these different mollusks. The Native Americans that were here used these shellfish for a wide variety of things. They were their food source for certain, high calorie, high protein foods, but they also used them for multiple other things. They were a source of technology. They would make shells into hammers, into adzes that would be used to chop and work wood. They would use them as weights on the bottom of their nets to hold them down in the water. In addition to technology, they also saw an intrinsic beauty and symbolism in the shell. One shell in particular, the Busicon sinistrum, the lightning whelk, is used widely for a variety of things. They made it into shell masks that would have potentially been worn and were traded all the way up into the Dakotas and southern Canada. They made it into shell beads and other ornaments that they would have worn. Often shells were interred with individuals after they passed on to their next life. Shells were also used down here in South Florida and in many places around the world where shellfish are an abundant resource as a building material. Calusa sites and their ancestors who were here on the coast before them were constructed of alternating layers of shell and earth. If you imagine throwing away a bunch of garbage, shellfish, smelly, disintegrating garbage, that doesn't sound like something you'd want to live on. Well, archaeologically, we have some evidence that they might have thrown this shell away underwater so that other animals might come onto those shelly areas. Fish would eat away at the viscera. Other shellfish would use that leftover meat before they put that material on top of the mound. And maybe they even used old mounds that they weren't living at anymore to build their mounds higher. One of the other ways we know that shell is being used as a building material is because many of the sites, the archaeological sites, these villages that were occupied by indigenous Floridians, have a distinctive pattern. Around 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, in a time period we call the Archaic, these shells were used to build sites that were horseshoe shaped or semicircular, these what we call shell ring sites. Later in time, the Calusa used them to construct much taller mounded landscapes, some of which match. The major sites on the landscape both have two large frontal mounds with a canal that runs between them. If you happen to find yourself on one of these sites, or one of these sites that's eroding into the estuaries down here on the Barrier Islands and mainland of South Florida, and you find an artifact, the best thing to do is leave it in place, record where you are, and tell somebody. There's a number of public archaeology and historical organizations here in South Florida, like the Bonita Springs Historical Society. They'll be able to put you in touch with the right people to get that site recorded, so many more people can stumble upon that same setting. After the European and American pioneers moved down here to South Florida, and eventually roadways took the place of waterways as the primary means of transportation, projects like the Tamiami Trail, which opened in 1928, these pioneers and many of the families that are still here can tell you the Native American villages, these shell mound sites, were recycled. The shell was used as road fill and road base, and also added with cement to make a form of concrete called tabby. After the Tamiami Trail opened, businesses started to crop up along the roadside that would entice travelers and tourists to stop, spend their money, and stay in the area. This included gas stations, restaurants, campgrounds, hotels, fruit and gift stands, and many, many, many shops that sold seashells. Gathering the seashells to sell was a little bit of work, but it provided great merchandise to sell. A shop opened up here in Bonita Springs that some of you may have heard of, the Shell Factory. Not only did they sell local shells, but they also sold shells from around the world, and they even had a catalog order business throughout the United States. So how did the Shell Factory get started? Well, in 1938, Harold Krant came down to vacation here with his wife, and they saw these beautiful seashells on the beaches. They decided to make a business out of it. He set up with a business partner and they bought property on Terry Street and Old US 41, and that shell store ultimately became the Shell Factory. Not long after, the Shell Factory became the largest employer here in Bonita Springs. Many of the shells that were sold at the Shell Factory came from the local McMillan family. Harold Krant and his partner came to own many other businesses as well: the Shell Jungle Seminole Village, the Mystery House, and the Dome fruit and juice stand that was in the shape of an orange and demolished in 1992. In 1952, on New Year's Eve, fire destroyed the Shell Factory, and it was a big economic loss at the time to Bonita Springs. But the beaches are still here, and after each high tide, the shelling is still a main tourist attraction. So as long as we are good stewards of our coastal environments, children today and children in the future, like the Calusa before them and their ancestors, will be able to wander the beaches and pick up shells to keep and treasure.